Guy Fawkes Night, also known as Bonfire Night, is an annual commemoration observed on the 5th of November, primarily in Great Britain. Its history begins with the events of the 5th of November 1605, when Guy Fawkes, a member of the Gunpowder Plot, was arrested while guarding explosives that plotters had placed beneath the House of Lords. Celebrating the fact that King James I had survived the attempt on his life, people lit bonfires around London, and months later, the introduction of the observance of the 5th of November Act enforced an annual public day of thanksgiving for the plot's failure. So this one man's face, even 400 or so years after his death, has become an icon for people looking to stand up to power. The image of Guy Fawkes has been fashioned for modern protest purposes. People now have a preconceived idea of the man and his ideology. That idea of Fawkes largely stems from his use in V for Vendetta, a 2006 movie based on the comic books by Alan Moore, about a mysterious masked revolutionary who brings down a totalitarian regime, succeeding, however, where Fawkes failed, by blowing up Parliament. However, this is somewhat misleading. The actual story of Fawkes is more intertwined with religious history in England than the movie or the comic series lets on. Fawkes was born to Catholic parents, a time where Catholics were very much an oppressed minority within England. When King Henry VIII broke away from Rome in the 1530s, the country was thrown into turmoil over religious ideology until Queen Elizabeth I acceded the throne in 1558. Under Queen Elizabeth I, the English church becomes a Protestant church, and Catholicism is forced underground. Also, if you didn't go to the regular state church and their services, you were fined. And many of the people who didn't go to these churches paid because they couldn't stomach going to the Protestant services. It was out of these circumstances that another man, Robert Catesby, planned the Gunpowder Plot. The plan was to assassinate King James I of England by blowing up the Parliament building while the king was there. What they were looking for was either Catholic supremacy or at least a government set up where Catholics were to have full toleration. So Guy Fawkes has some virtue. What do I mean by this? Well, let's bring out some of his virtuous aspects. He does not compromise the one true Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the true faith, and he's willing to die for his faith. And the man certainly has some piety. Now, of course, he's not perfect. Blowing up Parliament and murdering is inherently evil. However, Guy Fawkes was a man of his times, and he likely considered that this extreme action was just, given the extreme circumstances. But let's meditate a bit more on what it meant for Guy Fawkes to be a man of his time. Well, for starters, the Christian Crusades had only ended about 300 years ago. Public burnings and executions were still quite prevalent. And once more, Guy Fawkes himself would have seen fellow Catholics put to death in all kinds of brutal ways. His participation, therefore, in this plot is not virtuous, but is nonetheless understandable. And there is no denying Guy Fawkes at least exhibited a few virtues, at least here or there. Guy Fawkes was not even the master conspirator in the Gunpowder Plot. He was the guy tasked to plant the charges in Westminster Palace, but because the plot was unsuccessful and Fawkes was caught, he has become the face of it. But let's talk more about the life of Guy Fawkes now and the actual Gunpowder Plot itself and what it entailed. Guy Fawkes was born in 1570 in Stonegate, York. He was the second of 4 children born to Edward Fawkes and his wife Edith. Guy's parents were regular communicants of the Church of England, as were his paternal grandparents. The exact date of Fawkes' birth is unknown, but he was baptised in the Church of St. Michael le Belfré on the 16th of April. As the customary gap between birth and baptism was 3 days, he was most likely born on the 13th of April. Guy's mother's family were recusant Catholics. A recusant Catholic was a Catholic who refused to attend the Anglican Church services. Once more, his cousin, Richard Cowling, became a Jesuit priest. In 1579, when Guy was 8 years old, his father died. His mother remarried several years later to a recusant Catholic, Dennis Bainbridge. Fawkes may have become a Catholic through the Bainbridge family's recusant tendencies, but perhaps also from his time at St. Peter's School in York. A governor at the school had spent about 20 years in prison for recusancy, and his headmaster, John Pullion, came from a family of noted Yorkshire recusants, the Pullions of Blubberhouses, which, yes, is a rather strange name. In her 1915 work The Pullions of Yorkshire, author Catherine Pullion suggested that Fawkes' Catholic education came from some of his relatives, who were known for harbouring priests, one of whom later accompanied Fawkes to Flanders, France in 1592. Fawkes' fellow students included John Wright and his brother Christopher, both later involved with Fawkes in the Gunpowder Plot, and still more of his fellow students included Oswald Tesimond, Edward Oldcorn, and Robert Middleton, who became priests. The latter, Robert Middleton, executed in 1601. After leaving school, and after selling the estate in York that he had inherited from his father, Fawkes travelled to the European continent to fight in the 80 Years' War for Catholic Spain against the new Dutch Republic from 1595 until a peace treaty was signed in 1598. Although England was not by then engaged in land operations against Spain, the two countries were still at war, and the Spanish Armada of 1588 was only 5 years in the past. So Fawkes then joined Sir William Stanley, an English Catholic and veteran commander in his mid-50s, who had raised an army in Ireland to fight in Leicester's expedition to the Netherlands. Stanley had been held in high regard by Queen Elizabeth I. But following his surrender to the Spanish in 1587, he and most of his troops had switched sides to serve Spain. Fawkes became a junior officer, fought well, and by 1603 had been recommended for a captaincy. That same year, 1603, Fawkes travelled to Spain to seek support for a Catholic rebellion in England. He used the occasion to adopt the Italian version of his name, Guido, and in his memorandum described King James I as, quote, a heretic who intended, quote, to have all of the papist sect driven out of England. He denounced Scotland and the king's favourites among the Scottish nobles, writing, quote, "It will not be possible to reconcile these two nations, as they are, for very long," end quote. Although he was received politely, the court of King Philip III of Spain was unwilling to offer him any support. In 1604, Fawkes became involved with a small group of English Catholics led by Robert Catesby, who planned to assassinate the Protestant King James and replace him with his daughter, third in line of succession, Prince Elizabeth. Fawkes was described by the Jesuit priest and former school friend, Oswald Tesimond, as, quote, a pleasant sort of person, with a cheerful manner, opposed to quarrels and strife, loyal to his friends. Tesimond also claimed Fawkes was, quote, a man highly skilled in matters of war, and that it was this mixture of piety and professionalism which endeared him to his fellow conspirators. The author, Antonia Fraser, describes Fawkes as, quote, a tall, powerfully built man with thick reddish-brown hair, a flowing moustache in the tradition of the time, and a bushy reddish-brown beard, and that he was, quote, a man of action, capable of intelligent arguments as well as physical endurance, somewhat to the surprise of his enemies. The first meeting of the 5 central conspirators took place on Sunday the 12th of May 1604, at an inn called the Duck and Drake, in the fashionable Strand district of London. Catesby, or Catesby as I've referred to him previously, I will now call him Catesby just for ease of convenience. Catesby had already proposed at an earlier meeting with Thomas Winter and John Wright to kill the king and his government by blowing up, quote, the Parliament House with gunpowder, end quote. Winter, who at first objected to the plan, was convinced by Catesby to travel to the continent to seek help. Winter met with the Constable of Castile, the exiled Welsh spy Hugh Owen, and Sir William Stanley, who said that Catesby would receive no support from Spain. The Welsh spy Hugh Owen did, however, introduce Winter to Fawkes, who had by then been away from England for many years, and thus was largely unknown in the country. Winter and Fawkes were contemporaries. Each was militant and had first-hand experience of the unwillingness of the Spaniards to help. Winter told Fawkes of their plan, and thus, in April of 1604, the two men returned to England. One of the conspirators, Thomas Percy, was promoted in June 1604, gaining access to a house in London that belonged to John Wynyard, keeper of the King's wardrobe. Fawkes was installed as a caretaker and began using the pseudonym John Johnson, servant to Percy. The contemporaneous account of the prosecution, taken from Thomas Winter's confession, claimed that the conspirators attempted to dig a tunnel from beneath Wynyard's house to Parliament, although this story may have been a government fabrication. No evidence for the existence of a tunnel was presented by the prosecution, and no trace of one has ever been found. Fawkes himself did not admit the existence of such a scheme until his 5th interrogation, but even then he could not locate the tunnel. If this story is true, however, by December 1604, the conspirators were busy tunnelling from their rented house to the House of Lords. They ceased their efforts when, during tunnelling, they heard a noise from above. Fawkes was sent out to investigate, and returned with the news that the tenant's widow was clearing out a nearby undercroft, directly beneath the House of Lords. The plotters purchased the lease to the room, which also belonged to John Wynyard. Unused and filthy, it was considered an ideal hiding place for the gunpowder the plotters planned to store. According to Fawkes, 20 barrels of gunpowder were brought in at first, followed by 16 more on the 20th of July. On the 28th of July, however, the ever-present threat of the plague delayed the opening of Parliament until Tuesday the 5th of November. This very well may have saved the king's life. A few of the conspirators were concerned about fellow Catholics who would be present at Parliament during the opening on the 5th of November. And also, quite mysteriously, on the evening of the 26th of October, Lord Monteagle received an anonymous letter warning him to stay away and to, quote, retire yourself in safety, for they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, end quote. This letter, called the so-called Monteagle letter, survives in the National Archives to this day. This letter was presumably written by a fellow Catholic who feared for Lord Monteagle, who was a Catholic himself, though the letter's origins remains a mystery, and it was not penned by one of the conspirators. However, despite quickly becoming aware of the letter, the conspirators resolved to continue with their plans, as it appeared that it, quote, was clearly thought to be a hoax, end quote. Fawkes checked the Undercroft on the 30th of October and reported that nothing had been disturbed. Lord Monteagle's suspicions had been aroused, however, and the letter was shown to King James. The King ordered a search of the cellars underneath Parliament that took place in the early hours of the 5th of November. Fawkes had taken up his station late on the previous night, armed with a slow match and a watch given to him by Percy, quote, because he should know how the time went away, end quote. Fawkes was found leaving the cellar shortly after midnight and was arrested. Inside, the barrels of gunpowder were discovered, hidden under piles of firewood and coal. Fawkes gave his name as John Johnson and was first interrogated by members of the King's Privy Chamber, where he remained defiant. When asked by one of the lords what he was doing in possession of so much gunpowder, Fawkes answered that his intention was, quote, to blow you Scotch beggars back to your native mountains. He identified himself as a 36-year-old Catholic from Yorkshire and gave his father's name as Thomas and his mother's as Edith Jackson. Wounds on his body, noted by questioners, he explained as the effects of pleurisy. Fawkes admitted his intention to blow up the House of Lords and expressed regret at his failure to do so. His steadfast manner earned him the admiration of King James, who described Fawkes as possessing, quote, a Roman resolution, end quote. James' admiration, though, did not, however, prevent him from ordering on the 6th of November that, quote, John Johnson, end quote, be tortured to reveal the names of his co-conspirators. He directed that the torture be light at first, referring to the use of manacles, but more severe if necessary, authorising the use of the rack. Fawkes was transferred to the Tower of London. The King composed a list of questions to be put to, quote, Johnson, such as, quote, as to what he is, for I can never hear yet of any man that knows him, end quote, and another, quote, when and where he learned to speak French, end quote, and, quote, if he was a papist, who brought him up in it, end quote. The room in which Fawkes was interrogated subsequently became known as the Guy Fawkes room. Sir William Wade, Lieutenant of the Tower, supervised the torture and obtained Fawkes' confession. He searched his prisoner and found a letter addressed to Guy Fawkes. To Wade's surprise, quote, Johnson, end quote, remained silent, revealing nothing about the plot or its authors. On the night of the 6th of November, Wade's report thus says that he, i.e. Johnson, told us that since he undertook this action, he did every day pray to God he might perform that which might be the advancement of the Catholic faith and the salvation of his own soul, end quote. According to Wade, Fawkes managed to rest through the night, despite his being warned that he would be interrogated until, quote, I had gotten the inner secret of his thoughts and all his complices, end quote. His composure was broken at some point during the following day. The observer, Sir Edward Hoby, remarked, quote, since Johnson's being in the Tower, he beginneth to speak English, end quote. Fawkes revealed his true identity on the 7th of November and told his interrogators that there were 5 people involved in the plot to kill the king. He began to reveal their names on the 8th of November and told how they intended to place Princess Elizabeth on the throne. His third confession, on the 9th of November, implicated Francis Tresham. Following the Ridolfi Plot of 1571, prisoners were made to dictate their confessions before copying and signing them, if they still could. Although it is uncertain if he was tortured on the rack, Fawkes' scrawled signature bears testament to the suffering he endured at the hands of his interrogators. The trial of 8 of the plotters began on Monday the 27th of January 1606. Fawkes shared the barge from the Tower to Westminster Hall with 7 of his co-conspirators. They were kept in the Star Chamber before being taken to Westminster Hall, where they were displayed on a purpose-built scaffold. The king and his close family, watching in secret, were among the spectators as the Lords Commissioners read out the list of charges. Fawkes was identified as Widow Fawkes, otherwise called Widow Johnson. He pleaded not guilty, despite his apparent acceptance of guilt from the moment he was captured. The outcome was never in doubt. The jury found all the defendants guilty, and the Lord Chief Justice, Sir John Popham, found them guilty of high treason. The Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke, told the court that each of the condemned would be drawn backwards to his death by a horse, his head near the ground. They were to be, quote, put to death halfway between heaven and earth, as unworthy of both, end quote. Their genitals would be cut off and burnt before their eyes, and their bowels and hearts removed. They would then be decapitated, and the dismembered parts of their bodies displayed so that they may become, quote, prey for the fowls of the air, end quote. Fawkes' and Tresham's testimony regarding the Spanish treason was read aloud, as well as confessions related specifically to the Gunpowder Plot. The last piece of evidence offered was a conversation between Fawkes and Winter, who had been kept in adjacent cells. The two men apparently thought they had been speaking in private, but their conversation was intercepted by a government spy. When the prisoners were allowed to speak, Fawkes explained his not guilty plea as ignorance of certain aspects of the indictment. On the 31st of January 1606, Fawkes and 3 others, Thomas Winter, Ambrose Rookwood, and Robert Keyes, were dragged from the Tower on wattled hurdles to the old palace yard at Westminster, opposite the building they had attempted to destroy. His fellow plotters were then hanged and quartered. Fawkes was the last to stand on the scaffold. He asked for forgiveness of the king and state, while keeping up his, quote, crosses and idol ceremonies, i.e., Catholic practices. Weakened by torture and aided by the hangman, Fawkes began to climb the ladder to the noose. But either through jumping to his death or climbing too high so the rope was incorrectly set, he managed to avoid the agony of the latter part of his execution by breaking his neck. His lifeless body was nevertheless quartered, and was the custom, body parts were then distributed to, quote, the 4 corners of the kingdom, to be displayed as a warning to other would-be traitors. On the 5th of November 1605, just after the Gunpowder Plot was thwarted, Londoners were encouraged to celebrate the king's escape from assassination by lighting bonfires. Quote, always provided that this testimony of joy be carefully done without any danger or disorder, end quote. An Act of Parliament designated each 5th of November as a day of thanksgiving for, quote, the joyful day of deliverance, end quote, and remained in force until 1859. These annual celebrations were essentially anti-Catholic celebrations up until 1859. However, now, within England, it has become a secular holiday and an excuse to light a bonfire on a cold night, drink, eat, and be merry. And so this is the legacy of Guy Fawkes. And here also the sad tale of Guy Fawkes ends. He was a man who tried his best to serve the Catholic faith, despite his shortcomings and moral weaknesses. May God have mercy on his soul. Amen.